Greetings, viewer. Don't forget to visit my website for links to support the production of these works if you value what I'm doing. I appreciate any help you can offer. Thank you for having a look and a listen. Yours, John Loth. The Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley. Read by John Loth. Chapter 8. Canaanite and Minoan Civilizations. Two civilizations, utterly dissimilar in character, serve as connecting links between Sumerian culture and classical civilization. Of these, Minoan civilization is considerably the older, beginning to form before 3000 BC and dissolving to death about 1000 BC. The younger Canaanite civilization followed along at least a millennium later, in the period 2200 BC to 2250 BC. The difference in character of the two is almost as great as could be, the younger one being violent and bloodthirsty, especially in its religious ceremonies, to a degree exceeded by no other society except perhaps the Mesoamerican during the Aztec period, while Minoan society was gentle and peaceful, without temples or any known religious ceremonies. Chronologically, Minoan civilization should be discussed first, but logically it is better to reverse the order because of the close cultural relations between Minoan society and classical civilization to be discussed in the chapter to follow. Part A. Canaanite Civilization. Because of its exposed geographic position at the crossroads between Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Hittite civilizations, and the frequent incursions of these powerful cultures into its core area, Canaanite society has the most distorted sequence of stages of any civilization we shall discuss. Of its importance there can be no doubt, since it contributed much to later peoples, including the alphabet and two great religions. But its basic unity as a single society is frequently missed because of emphasis placed on geographic areas, linguistic groupings, political units, or religious groups. The situation is further complicated by the fact that its universal empire, Carthage, was so distant as to justify to many students a completely isolated treatment from the core area, the Levant, whence it arose. The instrument of expansion of Canaanite society is also a source of difficulty because it is a type of economic organization so familiar to us that it is taken as a matter of course without the emphasis which is placed, for example, on Mesopotamian temple administration or the domination of Egyptian economic life by the pharaonic state. The Canaanite instrument of expansion seems to have been commercial capitalism. Thus, it is similar to the instrument of expansion that gave our Western civilization its second stage of expansion in 1440 to 1690. Capitalism must be defined, if we wish to be scientific, as a form of economic organization motivated by the pursuit of profit within a price structure. Thus defined, it should be evident that there can be more than one kind of capitalism, and that any kind can perform as an instrument or perform with decreasing effectiveness by becoming institutionalized. When profits are pursued by geographic interchange of goods, so that commerce for profit becomes the central mechanism of the system, we usually call it commercial capitalism. In such a system, goods are conveyed from areas where they are more common, and therefore cheaper, to areas where they are less common, and therefore less cheap. This process leads to regional specialization and to division of labor, both in agricultural production and in handicrafts. Both of these, as well as the interlinking commercial groups, become specialized activities within a market nexus. It is extremely likely that Canaanite society developed commercial capitalism as its instrument of expansion because its core area, the Levant, was on the western approaches to the Syrian saddle, at the point where these approaches shifted from waterborne to land transportation. This point was the juncture between the demand for raw materials, especially metals, created by the high standard of living of Mesopotamian civilization to the east, and the sources of such raw materials, accessible by water, to the west. These created a powerful mutual attraction that could hardly fail to turn the incipient Canaanite society toward trading for profit. In fact, this attraction was operating even before the Canaanites settled on the western approaches to the Syrian saddle, about 2200 BC. It drew into this activity the Proto-Assyrian peoples on the eastern approaches of the Syrian saddle, on the upper Tigris drainage, so that these Assyrian speakers were settled as far west as southern Anatolia, Cappadocia, if not farther, in defended trade posts even before 2200 BC. Commercial capitalism, as an instrument of expansion, has powerful tendencies to become institutionalized, to the injury of continued economic advance. Such institutionalization arises when pursuit of profit becomes dominant over the real, if remote, goals of any economic system. These real goals include high enjoyment of wealth and can be analyzed into high production, high distribution, and high consumption of goods. As long as the pursuit of profits serves to assist these goals, any profit organization of the economic system remains an instrument. But this is likely to continue only as long as the trading system is a competitive one. As long as the competitive aspect of the organization continues, each entrepreneur seeks to obtain a larger share of the total trade for himself and invests his savings, as in ships, wharves, and warehouses, in order to do so. Such investment increases the total volume of trade, which in turn increases the total volume of production on one side and the total volume of consumption on the other side. This increase in wealth has eventually an adverse effect on the volume of profits, since profits, meaning a surplus over the total of the costs of production and of distribution, require a scarcity system. Increase in volume, by making goods less scarce, reduces the margin by which retail selling prices exceed costs and thus, in general terms, jeopardizes profits. When this occurs and the commercial traders are in a position to reduce their mutual competition, they seek to manage the market by reducing volume in order to raise profits. In this way, profits become dominant over wealth as an economic goal, to the jeopardy of volume and high living standards. Means have become ends, or as we put it, an instrument has become an institution. This process took place in our own Western civilization about the 17th century, and of that process we generally say that commercial capitalism, or the commercial revolution in the older books, was transformed into mercantilism. In Canaanite society, we speak of the rise of a commercial oligarchy in the later days of Phoenicia or of Carthage. When this occurred, the society ceased to expand by economic means, that is, by increasing volume of wealth or by intensification of economic activities, and tried to expand by political means, that is, to increase profits by extensification of economic activities, by bringing wider geographic areas under the institutionalized economic organization. Thus, the economic imperialism and wars typical of stage 4 of any civilization replaced the earlier economic expansion, which also involved geographic expansion, but by exploration and colonization rather than by imperialist wars. 1. Mixture. The period of mixture in Canaanite society is clear enough, about 2200 BC, and for several centuries after that, the Amaru were pushing out of the Syrian desert into the Fertile Crescent. Those who moved eastward into Mesopotamia we call Amorites, Babylonians, while those who moved westward into the Levant are generally called Canaanites. Many of these intruders were pastoral peoples with herds of sheep or asses, but it is possible that some of them were tillers of the soil. In any case, they were Semite peoples, warlike and patriarchal, with a multiplicity of gods. Some of these deities were simple animalistic spirits found in rocks, trees, or springs. Others were spirits of nature, including deities of storms, the sky, fertility, fire, water, and such. Others were gods of more abstract ideas, representing the creator, justice, mercy, or crafts. This variety of deities in itself reflects a mixed culture coming into a situation where further mixture was inevitable. These other peoples came chiefly from Mesopotamia to the east and from Egypt to the south. But the Indo-European people from the north, known as Mitanni, and the Alpine peoples from the same direction, whom we call Hurrians, helped to contribute to what must have been a very complex mixture. And finally, during the middle centuries of the second millennium BC, there were pervasive cultural elements from the seaways to the west, especially from Crete. These included Minoan and later Mycenaean influences. Thus it would seem that the period of mixture could be stretched to cover almost a whole millennium, from about 2300 to about 1300 BC. In spite of this great mixture of different elements, Canaanite society developed its own distinctive outlook and character. Vigorous, practical, almost crude, grasping, unaesthetic, yet with powerful spiritual impulses, filled with sensual desires and crass superstitions, yet with basic intelligence, the equal of any other people in history. Such was the complex nature of these Canaanite peoples, a nature which leaves them, to this day, a constant puzzle and source of interest to students. Whatever may have been the social organization of the Canaanites before they migrated, they came into the Fertile Crescent organized on the basis of blood groupings, either as families or tribes. Almost at once, the more successful of these groupings began to hack out areas of influence and create principalities organized on a somewhat different basis, since they claimed powers over peoples who were not related to the family of the prince. Thus, the idea of the state, coming perhaps from the city civilizations not far off, began to replace the older ideas of tribal loyalty and blood vengeance. The second millennium was still in its early centuries when a series of Amaru princes ruled the whole Fertile Crescent from the Persian Gulf to the Nile, and as Hyksos were beginning to force their way into Egypt. Amorite names like Abraham, Jacob, and Benjamin were recorded in cuneiform writing for the whole area. Tribal or family influence was still so powerful in most places that individual rights were very weak, and a strong family group was a better guarantee of personal safety or of individual rights than either personal prowess or princely power. In this rapidly developing society, there were scattered persons whom the documents called Habiru, or some similar term. They are recorded from Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Levant. The meaning of the term Habiru is disputed, but it seems to apply to persons whose social position did not provide them with the protection of blood relatives and of the threat of retaliatory feuding by their families. They were what Maitland called in the early Middle Ages in England landless and kin-shattered men. The cause of this kin-shattered condition, which left the Habiru in a precarious social condition, is fairly clear. Any individual who had killed a member of his own family obviously lost the protection of that family and became socially isolated. Or again, any person who had made a formal agreement to become the bondsman of another had voluntarily renounced the protection of his blood relatives. Similarly, men who bound themselves to fight for money could not expect their families to stand by prepared to avenge any injuries they might suffer in their combats. Such persons, without family to protect them or to force the prince to extend his protection, needed some other protector. This was found by seeking the favor of Yahweh, the God of mercy, one of the lesser deities in the numerous Canaanite pantheon. Such allegiance to Yahweh by bondsmen, murderers, or other kin-shattered persons did not originally imply any renunciation of the other deities in the Canaanite pantheon, and the Habiru continued to worship, as seemed fit, the other Canaanite Baals, working downward from the greatest, El, God of justice and creator of the world. The economic activities of these Habiru were probably not much different from those of other Canaanites. But two comments might be made. As persons with weak or no kinship ties, they probably wandered about from place to place more readily than other Canaanites. And there clearly seems to be, among the Habiru, a large portion of wandering metal workers and music makers. Some of these metal workers were known as Kenites, a name traditionally derived from Cain, the son of Adam. It is worth noting that the mark the Lord put upon Cain was not a mark of damnation, as some believe, but a mark of protection. The Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who come upon him should kill him. It would appear thus that the Habiru, who became the worshippers of Yahweh and later strict monotheists, began as a legal or social group, later, at the time of Moses, became a religious group, and still later, at the time of Joshua, began to develop into a political group. Much later, after the Assyrian destruction of the Hebrew state, they became once more primarily a religious group, although there always were tendencies to become a political group by establishing Hebrew rule in some area, or to become a biological group by insisting on endogamy, or to become a biological group by insisting on endogamy. At any rate, the Hebrews always were a group within Canaanite society and never became a society of their own. 2. Gestation. Because the process of mixture continued so long in Canaanite civilization, probably because of the very exposed geographic position of the Levant, we cannot fix any rigid date when mixture ended and gestation began. There was rather a series of advances and relapses, not only in regard to these two stages, but possibly in regard to the next as well. Moreover, the instrument of expansion we have posited for this society, commercial capitalism, is one in which there is no great interval between accumulation of surplus, plowing of this surplus back into the business, and increase of output arising from such investment. This process undoubtedly existed among the Canaanites at an early date in the second millennium, but it seems clear that the Levant was too closely dominated by Egyptian and Hittite influences for us to attribute much of its social dynamics to Canaanite organization until fairly well along in the second millennium. By 1300, Egyptian power was in full retreat from the Levant, and a century later the Hittite Empire was breaking up under the blows of the Iron Age invaders. At that point, about 1200, the period of expansion of Canaanite society was beginning. 3. Expansion. The period of expansion of Canaanite society began as the withdrawal of Egyptian and Hittite influence and the absorption of Hurrian and Mitanni peoples allowed this new commercial society to emerge. At that time, we find a threefold situation. The Canaanite pagans in control of the southern Levant were being squeezed between the Philistines coming in from the sea to the west and the Hebrews coming in from the desert to the east. The Canaanite pagans in this period were to be found not only in Palestine, but also in Syria, where they were already engaged in the Levantine trading activities we associate with the Phoenicians. In fact, they were early Phoenicians, although historians usually call them by the names of their respective cities. Of these cities, the best known are probably Ras Shamra and Al-Alach in northern Syria. The archaeological evidence from these, especially from Ras Shamra, the ancient Ugarit, shows a flourishing trade going on between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean peoples, particularly the Mycenaeans, from 1700 to 1200. It is clear that the period of expansion, in this area at least, was in full swing before the 14th century BC. By the end of that century, pressure from the Hittites and the damage caused by the great earthquake of about 1365 BC had hampered these more northern seaports and provided an opportunity for more southern seaports, such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, to break into the western trade. It was these Phoenician cities that took Canaanite commerce through the age of expansion. While these developments were occurring in the north, the Hebrew peoples were forming in the south. Some Habiru had accompanied the Hyksos into Egypt in the 18th century BC. When these shepherd peoples were expelled from Egypt by Osmos I, about 1567, many of the Habiru remained, working as copper miners and coppersmiths in Sinai, or as bondsmen and mercenary soldiers in Egypt itself. In time, Egyptian rule over these peoples became increasingly oppressive. About 1300, a man with the Egyptian name of Moses killed an Egyptian and had to flee into the eastern deserts beyond Sinai. There he became acquainted with Yahweh, married the daughter of the Midianite priest of Yahweh, and returned to Egypt to lead the Habiru to safety. Instead of following the regular coast road from Egypt to Canaan, Moses led his followers eastward into the desert. After the revelation on Mount Sinai and the death of Moses, the new leader, Joshua, led the Hebrews into Canaan by making a wide swing into the desert to the east. The invaders sacked the Canaanite city of Jericho, which guarded the approach road from the east, about 1230, but were unable to cross the hills down into the western plains, where the Canaanite war chariots were still undefeated. The new invention of lime-plastered cisterns for catching rain made it possible for the Israelites to expand along the hitherto unoccupied hills above the Canaanite-controlled springs and streams. Eventually, the Canaanites were absorbed between the Hebrew pressure from the eastern hills and the seaborne invasions of the Philistines from the west, 1200 to 1000. But the basic character of Canaanite culture was not greatly changed. There was a good deal of mutual assimilation and agricultural resettlement, but the chief changes were the acquisition by the Hebrews of agriculture with iron tools and weapons. By 1000 BC, the chief distinction between Hebrews and Canaanites was religious. The former slowly abandoning the old, bloodthirsty Canaanite gods in favor of a supreme God of mercy and justice, as a result of Moses' covenant from Mount Sinai. Even this was a slow process, and for many centuries, persons who called themselves Hebrews, including the well-known kings of Israel, lapsed into polytheistic acts. In Canaan, the Hebrews built up two kingdoms in the interior of the country. Judah extended from the northern end of the Dead Sea at Jericho to the northern end of the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba, and Israel extended from Jericho northward to Mount Hermon. Except for a short stretch from the latitude of Jericho north to Mount Carmel, the Hebrews did not control the Mediterranean seacoast, the southern section remaining in the hands of the Philistines, while the northern section, Syria, rested in the hands of the Canaanites, Phoenicians. Under David and Solomon, circa 1010 to 930, the priestly democracy of the earlier Hebrews, known as the period of the Judges, was replaced by an autocratic, militaristic monarchy patterned after other Oriental kingdoms, with a standing army, a governmental bureaucracy, and annual taxes. Israel and Judah were united into the Kingdom of Israel, with its capital at Jerusalem. With the help of Canaanite artisans and architects, a great temple and palace were built at Jerusalem, and a stone stable, capable of accommodating over 400 horses, was built at Megiddo. Although the Hebrews did not control the port cities of the Levant, they were able to finance this luxury by acting as middlemen in commercial relations between the Arabs of the Red Sea and the Canaanites of the Phoenician coast. Solomon built a great port city, Ezion-Geber, at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, and made a profitable alliance with the Hiram of Tyre in Phoenicia. The Sabaean Arabs of the Red Sea brought spices, myrrh, incense, gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks from India and other areas. The Phoenicians, for their part, began to push westward by 1000 BC, and within a couple of centuries had colonies at Carthage, Sardinia, Malaga, and Gades, and Gades, whence they brought copper, tin, and iron to their cities in the Levant. The overland route from Ezion-Geber to Phoenicia was controlled by Solomon, who added to the trade iron and copper from his extensive smelteries in the Jordan Valley, and horses bred in his great stud farm at Megiddo. In this way, the age of expansion of Canaanite civilization continued for about 5 or more centuries. It had the typical characteristics of such a period: increased production, growing population, geographic exploration and colonization, and increased knowledge. The increasing availability of iron weapons and the spread of a money economy undoubtedly helped to advance democracy in this period, although hardly enough to allow it to flourish. The Levant's exposed strategic position made any long-continued democracy unlikely. Nor is there much evidence for the existence of science. And finally, technological inventions, which are so often found in the age of expansion, were very rare. The one invention that must be emphasized is the alphabet, certainly one of the most significant in all of human history. This seems to have started in several forms, among a number of Amaru groups, quite early in the growth of Canaanite society, possibly in its age of gestation. The original idea may well have been based on the 24 monosyllabic symbols in Egyptian hieroglyphics, modified to fit the Canaanite tongue during the Hyksos period, or at least in the Sinai area. One of the chief services performed by the Canaanites was the re-establishment of law and order on the high seas after the turmoil of the Iron Age invasions and the movements of the peoples of the sea. This greatly increased Mediterranean trade and introduced certain Eastern factors into classical civilization during its period of mixture. 4. Conflict and Empire. The flourishing situation that we have described began to decline shortly after 800 BC in the Levant, although not until several generations later in the central and western Mediterranean. There was growing social unrest in Palestine, a renewed split between the two Hebrew kingdoms, democratic and puritanical agitations among certain religious leaders, generally inspired, it would seem, by those closer to the pastoral desert peoples. There was also a considerable growth in religious animosities, chiefly because of the survival of Canaanite fertility ideas among agricultural peoples, and because of Phoenician influences, as exercised through persons like Queen Jezebel. In addition to these troubles, there were growing external dangers, including renewed Egyptian invasions under Necho, 608 BC, increasing Aramean pressures, and above all, the continued savage assaults of the Assyrians. In a series of brutal attacks, the Levantine cities were looted, sacked, made tributary, and their leading citizens deported. The northern kingdom of Palestine, then called Samaria, was destroyed in 722, and the southern one, Judea, in 586. The more prominent citizens, perhaps 1/10 of the population, were deported to Babylon. The rest, mostly peasants, being left in Palestine. As a result of their exile, the upper classes became increasingly rigid in their religious orthodoxy. Accordingly, when some of these returned from their Babylonian captivity after the Persian conquest of Assyria in 538, controversy broke out between the more casual Palestinian peasantry and the more rigid Babylonian exiles. The chief disagreements were concerned with methods of sacrifice, use of images, and permission to marry non-Jews. All of these things added to the conflicts in the core area of Canaanite society, until that society had been almost torn to pieces by 500 BC. Although Tyre, situated on an island half a mile from the Levantine shore, continued to dominate the maritime commerce of the eastern Mediterranean until destroyed by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. In the meantime, the periods of expansion and conflict were occurring at somewhat later dates in the more peripheral west. The age of expansion probably continued there until about 600 BC, and was followed by a rather brief age of conflict. This was short, lasting little more than a century, because there was no other Canaanite state in the west in any position to challenge Carthage's claim to universal empire in that peripheral area, and because the social triumph of the commercial oligarchy within Carthage made class struggles insignificant. Carthage is to be regarded as the universal empire of Canaanite society, despite its lack of political influence in the core areas in the Levant, since the strategically indefensible position of the Levant in the face of Assyrian power made it hopeless for Carthage to have any political ambitions there. A parallel situation could arise in our own Western civilization if Soviet domination of Europe left the United States as the only significant political force in the Western Hemisphere. There can be no doubt that Carthage, as a political unit, was a part of Canaanite society. The inhabitants spoke a Canaanite tongue and called themselves Canaanites, although we usually speak of them by the name of the city and refer to their language by the Latin term Punic. Their organization of expansion was the same institutionalized commercial capitalism. Their religion was clearly Canaanite, full of bloodthirsty superstitions concerned with various Baals, especially Moloch. This god, who was worshipped by throwing infants into his raging fires, was the principal deity of Carthage and Tyre, and was not unknown in Palestine. There Solomon erected an altar to him, and other Israelites joined in his horrible sacrifices. This is only some of the evidence showing that Carthage, as a political unit, was in Canaanite culture. 5. Decay and invasion. By 500 BC, the period of decay was about to begin. 20 years later, 480, in both East and West, the Canaanite peoples suffered severe military defeats that serve as historical pointers to the downward way. In the East, the Phoenician fleet in the service of Persia was destroyed by the Greeks at Salamis, while in the West, Carthaginian forces were destroyed at Himera in Sicily by the forces of the Western Greeks. These two events, which folk tales placed on the same day, marked a collision between declining Canaanite culture in its age of early decay and rising classical civilization in its full flush of expansion. The final blow in this conflict did not fall until almost 4 centuries later. Canaanite culture slowly died in the East after Alexander destroyed Tyre in 332, and the same culture died more quickly in the West after Rome sacked Carthage in the Third Punic War, 146 BC. By the time of Christ, only a few remnants of this strange, distorted civilization still survived. B. Minoan civilization. It is unfortunate that we know so little about the Cretan or Minoan civilization, for it has a number of distinctions of considerable significance. It was the first civilization that was not in an alluvial river valley, and probably, as a consequence, it retained its Neolithic garden culture character more than any other. For one thing, it was peaceful, something that can hardly be said about other civilizations. It remained basically matriarchal, in the sense that women had at least social equality, if not social superiority. Its chief deity was female, and women undoubtedly had greater political influence than in any other ancient civilization. Its religion was so unformalized that it had no temples and, so far as our evidence goes, no formal religious ceremonies. And to complete a rather paradoxical picture, its instrument of expansion seems to have been a socialistic state, yet its people, instead of being oppressed and regimented, had an outlook that was remarkably happy, optimistic, and carefree. The statement that the instrument of expansion of Cretan civilization was a socialistic state is based on the fact that almost all handicraft production, commercial activities, and written records seem to be centered in large public buildings, such as the so-called palace at Knossos in Crete. The ruins of this prehistoric Pentagon building were excavated by Sir Arthur Evans after 1900. It is traditional among English archaeologists to call every large building that is excavated either a temple or a palace. And since Sir Arthur found no evidence of religious ceremonies in this large building, it had to be a palace, and its resident had to be a king. This king, according to Evans, was the legendary Minos, a Cretan ruler well known in Greek traditions of the historic period. But these traditions seem to indicate that Minos was a title like pharaoh or president, not a personal name, and that the office was, at least in one period, an elective rather than a hereditary one. Homer tells us quite specifically that Minos served for 9 years, so that he could have been a non-hereditary magistrate. This is supported by the evidence from the palace itself, since there is little trace of a personal ruler or of any effort to concentrate power, prestige, or honor about any single individual. Sir Arthur Evans called a small room containing a stone chair the throne room, but the small size both of room and chair make it look rather like a place where someone might sit down in the morning to tie his shoelaces. There is a great deal of art in the palace, but none of it could be interpreted as monarchical. In fact, pictures of individuals, especially males, are rather rare. There are some representations of females dressed in what, even today, would be considered daring costumes, but most of the pictures are of nature in its most beautiful moods. The sea, shot through with sparkling sunlight and enlivened with fish, squid, and other forms of marine life, or lake shores with flowers and birds, or wildlife in the countryside. Human figures appear occasionally, especially in connection with athletic events, notably with a rodeo-like scene in which youths and maidens vault over the head of a bull by grasping its horns and somersaulting over its head and landing on its back, facing rearward, and hop off. This latter scene is frequently explained as a religious ceremony, and it may well be, but here, as elsewhere, there is no centralization of personality, such as would almost inevitably appear in a monarchical regime, and which is so obvious in other socialistic civilizations such as the Egyptian, the Andean, or the Russian. 1. Mixture. The period of mixture of Cretan society goes back almost to the first settlements on the island, and may continue as late as the 3rd millennium. Rough dates could be set from before 3500 BC, perhaps as early as 4000, to after 3000. The elements that came together on this small island of Crete were 1. A mixed group from Anatolia, who may have been in the Mesolithic cultural stage, with a few early domestic animals, and pottery made to look like leather bags. 2. A Neolithic garden culture of the usual type, the major ingredient in the subsequent Cretan culture. 3. A significant Asiatic influence, possibly associated with the megalithic diffusion, bringing knowledge of metals. And 4. An Egyptian influence, which is sometimes attributed, without evidence, to refugees from the unification of Egypt by Menes, just before 3000 BC. The last two of these influences continued to flow for much of the early portion of Minoan history, so that Cretan art, for example, continued to show Egyptian influences, while Minoan writing, like that of Mesopotamia, was made by impressions on clay tablets. These civilizing influences did not change the basic Neolithic garden foundation of Cretan culture, except by building upon it, and the new society remained peaceful and cooperative. The most significant question, which, to my knowledge, has never been answered or ever asked, is how it was possible for a non-alluvial garden culture to adopt the fully sedentary life necessary for civilized existence. In a blunt sentence, why did not the early Minoans exhaust the fertility of the soil and have to shift their fields as their Neolithic ancestors did? The answer, probably, is that they developed a new diet which put less pressure on soil fertility. This diet was based on olive oil, grape wine, fish, and wheat, and proved so successful that it has remained the staple diet of the Mediterranean area to the present time. It is a very significant diet, in a number of ways, beyond its biologic adequacy for man. 2 of its elements were liquids, obtained from perennial plantings, while a 3rd was derived from the sea. Oil and wine required sedentary farming, and, at the same time, created a demand for pottery containers, which undoubtedly gave an impulse to craft specialization in this direction. In the palace of Knossos was row after row of man-high pottery jars that had been filled with oil, wine, and wheat. The use of fish for protein element in their diet served to tie the economy to the sea and provided the watercraft and maritime skills that allowed the Cretans to become the commercial middlemen of the Mediterranean basin when the need arose. And it is possible, although not clear from the evidence, that the grain fields could have been refertilized by products from the sea, such as burned seaweed. At any rate, the Cretan people in their earliest centuries began to work out an economic system that moved them toward cooperation, specialized activities, and dependence on the sea without population pressure on the soil. 2. Gestation. As in so many civilizations, the period of gestation of Minoan society must rest on inference. The argument that the instrument of expansion was the public authority is itself based on inference, although a fairly obvious one, but we can hardly go behind this inference to any more remote ones about origins. All that we can say is that the cooperative elements of Neolithic peasant agriculture were developed in the political security of an island existence and probably under the influence of the sea, toward the development of a cooperative, non-monarchical, non-militaristic, and non-ecclesiastical public authority. We do not know if there was only a single such authority for the whole island or several of them. The archaeological evidence shows several centers in which urban centralized living developed on the island, at Kenosis and Malea in the north, and at Phaistos and Hagia Triada in the south. The existence of palaces in all of these does not necessarily indicate separate political units, especially if these buildings were administrative centers, as we have suggested. There is a basic pattern in them all, and the latter ones may merely be decentralized administrative centers constructed by one political system. It has been suggested, largely because of the existence of a hard surface road across the island from Phaistos to Kenosis, that these two were merely seasonal residences for the same ruler. None of this kind of supposition gets us very far. The only established facts are that these various centers were unfortified and clearly lived in peaceful relationships, and that the whole island, by the second millennium, was a single political unit. Since this political unity was achieved without clear evidence of warfare, it is possible that it grew up in the early periods of Minoan history. The lack of fortifications would also indicate that the island had a unified control of the sea, and thus could protect itself against enemies from outside. 3. Expansion. By 2300 BC, after 1,000 years of existence, Cretan society was launched on a brilliant period of commercial expansion, cultural progress, and artistic accomplishment. It had a system of numbers and writing that is still beyond our ability to understand, and may remain so, especially if the language used was an unknown Asian language, as seems possible. We know about 100 words in the language, many of them place names, or names of objects used by later Greeks, but these do not seem to be related to any known languages. Words ending in "inth," like Corinth, hyacinth, plenith, and labyrinth, or words ending in "asa," like the Greek word for sea, thalassa, were originally Minoan. The writing, which was probably originally ideographic and rather pictographic, became increasingly linear, changing by jumps rather than by gradual development, as might be expected under a centralized political system. The commercial prosperity of Crete continued to grow in the first half of the second millennium, and was benefited rather than harmed by the Bronze Age invasions. These intrusions did not reach Crete itself, and the disturbances of the Hyrrians in the Levant and the Hyksos in Egypt made it possible for Crete to expand its economic life by adding craft activities to its commercial functions. Its products, including such objects as pottery, bronze weapons, engraved gems, and jewelry, were in great demand. The prosperity of the Bohemian Bronze Age and the growing trade of the Canaanite cities of Syria created new opportunities for Cretan traders. The palaces at various points were rebuilt on a more elaborate scale, especially at Kenosis and Phaistos. These two cities, 40 miles apart, were joined by a highway of paved cobblestones, provided with bridges. At the Kenosis end of this road stood an elaborate building, probably a hotel, offering all the conveniences necessary to the wary traveler, including baths and dinner in a beautiful large hall decorated with realistic frescoes of game birds. At Kenosis itself, the palace was a low, flat-topped structure covering about 5 acres. It had a system of baths and drains, flushed with water from rain tanks on the roofs. The naturalistic mural paintings were infused with nature, the open air, sunshine, and happiness. None showed warfare or death, religion, darkness, power, or majesty, as were commonly shown on the paintings of the other early civilizations. The fertility goddess was still worshipped, but the idea of her was quite changed. Gone was the pregnant Earth Mother, replaced by a glamorous female, slim and straight, attired in a modest dress with a low-cut neckline, a tight bodice, and a long, full skirt with many flounces. Her hair, piled in curls on her head, was fastened by gold pins. Even serious French books call her La Parisienne. This Cretan goddess was associated with snakes, birds, pillars, sacred trees, and the symbols of a double axe. These symbols came from Asia, but were given an additional lightness and elegance in Crete. The double axe symbol was marked plentifully on the walls of the palace. The building itself was called labyrinth in the Minoan language, an expression which meant house of the double axe. With its numerous rooms and long corridors of various levels, this building seemed like a maze to the naive Greek-speaking barbarians when they first saw it, since they were probably familiar with no house of more than 2 rooms. They took the word labyrinth to mean a maze where one became lost. We still use the word in this sense today. Beyond the labyrinth was the city, a center of 2- and 3-story rectangular houses, providing every evidence of a prosperous, happy, secular free society. This society, in the course of the second millennium, found its growth arrested by the slowing up of its rate of expansion. 4. Conflict in universal empire. It is very difficult for us to distinguish with any confidence the middle stages in the evolution of Minoan civilization. Our natural ignorance of the history of a society unknown through written evidence is intensified by the ambiguities to be expected in a civilization whose instrument of expansion was a socialist state. Of the general characteristics of the age of conflict, such as decreasing expansion, imperialist wars, class conflicts, and irrationality, we know almost nothing. There may have been class disturbances, or even inter-urban wars, but the evidence does not allow us to say so with any assurance. Just before the middle of the second millennium, layers of ashes indicate severe fires in most Cretan urban centers, but we cannot be sure if these resulted from class disturbances, or war, or from foreign invasions, or even from earthquakes. The possibility of these fires coming from earthquakes seems to be reduced by the fact that fortifications and a sharp rise in the occurrence of weapons seems to have appeared briefly in the Middle Minoan period. Moreover, a couple of centuries later, the style of writing made one of its periodic changes in kenosis, adopting a form known as lineal B, which we now know was used to write the Greek language. As kenosis was not sacked at that time, although it was somewhat later, about 1430 BC, we do not believe that these Greek speakers came in as invaders, but rather that they migrated in peacefully, perhaps by serving as workers or mercenary marines for the Cretan state. A reconstruction of the history of the Aegean area during the second millennium from the archaeological evidence on the island of Crete and also on the mainland of Greece, especially in Argos, can be made with a certain degree of confidence. The Bronze Age invaders who came down into the Balkans from the north during the first half of the second millennium were the first Greek-speaking persons to enter the area. We call them the Achaeans. On the whole, they probably came in small bands, or even as isolated warriors, in a peaceful way, with no desire to destroy the growing trade over the routes from Crete to the Central European Bronze Age. By military prowess and by marriage with the daughters of the matrilineal natives of Cretan colonists, these Greeks gradually established control over the area and over the commercial routes. Although the trade continued, the Achaeans extorted tribute from it and were able to use this wealth to build a barbaric, semi-civilized Cretan Achaean society. This mixed culture is generally known as Mycenaean, after its chief city at the head of the Gulf of Argos. Elsewhere, as at Athens to the northeast, the Cretans either retained or re-established control and were themselves in a position to demand tribute. In any case, for some time, a modus vivendi existed in which both peoples could enjoy the expanding commerce. In this process, the Achaeans became Cretanized and are called Mycenaeans. They seem to have gradually adopted the Cretan diet by replacing meat and animal products with the fruit of the vine, the olive tree, and the sea. They adopted the use of stone buildings and more naturalistic paintings, but the buildings were fortresses, and the pictures were of war, hunting, races, or other violent scenes. They largely shifted from cremation to burial of the dead, but they kept their beards, their patriarchal social patterns, and the loose, pinned clothing of flatland pastoralists, rather than the fitted, buttoned clothing of Crete. By 1450, this mixed Mycenaean culture covered much of Greece and had become, at least socially, the dominant element in Kenosis. The political structure seems to have been one of autonomous feudal princes surrounded by their war-loving retainers, the whole under the nominal overlordship of Mycenae, and supporting a life of luxury, idleness, and warlike adventure by the tribute imposed on Cretan commerce. The political relationship of Mycenae with Crete and the role of Kenosis are ambiguous. The mainland city may have functioned as an undependable ally, or it may have already taken over political power in Kenosis by peaceful means, either through slow immigration or by marriage into the commercial oligarchy of the country. By 1430, some Mycenaeans were no longer satisfied with their role. Taking advantage of political difficulties that Minos encountered in Sicily, and using their recently acquired knowledge of seafaring, some of the Greek speakers arose in revolt, sacked Kenosis, and permanently moved the center of Minoan civilization to the mainland. The next period is accordingly known as the Mycenaean Age, 1430 to 1150 BC, and represents the age of decay of Minoan society. 5. Decay and invasion. The Mycenaean peoples could sack and destroy, but they could not organize or control the complicated Minoan economic structure. This structure, based on commerce, required security and order along its trade routes, or it could not function. Such security had been provided on the sea by the Minoan fleet, but now the unruly Mycenaean warriors began to seize rather than to nurture commerce. As piracy rose, trade declined. On land, the long trade route from Argos to Central Europe had been maintained because of recognition of mutual benefits, and above all, by realization that small demands for tribute would provide income for an indefinite period, while total seizure of goods would kill the activities once for all. Although Cretan craftsmen continued for a long time to turn out work of high quality, the themes of this art became increasingly violent, turning from sun-drenched nature to scenes of war and the hunt. In time, artistic techniques declined, realism being replaced by heraldic, beasts, and geometric designs. The system was increasingly supported by piracy, plunder, and imposed tribute. Having crippled one great trade route to the north by the destruction of Kenosis, about 1430, the Mycenaeans could hardly permit the rival route to continue, and about 1184, they captured and sacked the second great commercial city of the Aegean, Troy. This city, of Anatolian rather than Aegean culture, existed from early in the third millennium, and its many levels of occupation give the archaeologist a dramatic picture of its tumultuous history. Its greatest city, the second on the site, had been destroyed by the Hittite invaders about 1900. Its sixth city, and relatively prosperous town, was destroyed by an earthquake about 1365. It was rebuilt almost immediately, but was sacked and described in Homer's Iliads by the Greeks in the 12th century. This event marked the end of the great Bronze Age archaic cultures everywhere in the West. Shortly afterward, the Iron Age invaders, the Dorians, Phrygians, Carians, and Lydians, poured out from the upper Balkans and wiped out the Trojan, Hittite, and Mycenaean cultures together. A dark age descended on the whole area west of the Levant for almost 2 centuries, 1100 to 900 BC. The process by which civilization, as an abstract entity distinct from the societies in which it is embodied, dies or is reborn is a very significant one. There are at least 5 steps in the process. Civilizations die as 1. Decreasing political security and the ending of law and order make property precarious and make personal violence an increasingly significant element in life. Accordingly, 2. Long-distance trade decreases. As a result, 3. Town life becomes precarious, and there is a general exodus from the towns as people try to find a place in which they can be attached in some stable social and economic relationship to the food-producing earth. Obviously, 4. There is a decline and even a disappearance of the middle classes. The property-owning, commercial, literate, city-dwelling group. And 5. Literacy rises rapidly. Civilization reappears through the same 5 steps, each in reverse. 1. Law and order are reestablished. 2. Commerce increases. 3. Cities appear and grow. 4. A middle class between soiled tillers and fighting men reappears. And 5. Literacy reappears as a technique of record-keeping and distant communication for the middle class. This process has passed through these steps several times, 2 of them at the 2 extremities of the life of classical civilization. This civilization, as is well known, had a dark ages at each end. The first, about 1100 to 900 BC, marked the division between Cretan civilization and classical culture, and the second, about AD 700 to 950, marked the division between classical civilization and Western. Each dark age is the period between the 5-step fall and the 5-step rise of civilization of which we speak. In the earlier of the 2, the political disorder that initiated the 5-step sequence is associated with the Mycenaean exploitation and the Dorian invasions. Then, generations later, law and order are reestablished in the Mediterranean by the activities of the Phoenicians, and the 5-stage sequence continued until classical culture was established. The second Dark Ages, at the end of classical culture, was initiated by the political insecurity associated with the Germanic invasions and the fall of Roman political power in the West. AD 476. It was ended and Western civilization begun by the same 5-step sequence, beginning about AD 970. The Iron Age invasions on both sides of the Aegean Sea established the basis on which the subsequent classical civilization was to rise. In the Balkans, itself the invaders, Dorians, came only a short distance from the north, but they came with such force and such destructive violence that the great mass of them ended up in southern Greece and in Crete itself. Thus, in the classical period, These were Doric-speaking areas and still retained the crudities of their ancestors. The chief state and leader of this group came to be Sparta. On the other hand, the Dorians drove southward so rapidly that they did not turn eastward into the islands and peninsulas of eastern Greece, and large enclaves of Mycenaean, that is mixed Achaean, Cretan, culture persisted. In the classical period, these survivals are known as Ionian, and became the highest representatives of later Greek culture, undoubtedly because of the survival of elements of Cretan culture. Some Mycenaeans, driven from their homes in Greece by the Dorian advance, crossed the Aegean and settled on the middle shores of the western coast of Anatolia, Asia Minor. These are also called Ionians, and the shore on which they settled is known as Ionia. Thus, closely related Ionian peoples with a similar culture and a common dialect lived on both the eastern and western shores of the middle Aegean Sea after 1000 BC. It was among these people, possessing strong elements of Minoan culture, that the new classical civilization was born. This culture was passed on to the later society, not only by surviving vestiges of social customs and personal outlook, but more explicitly through the works of Homer. These works, written in Ionia after the Dorian invasions, are based on memories of the great deeds of the Cretanized Achaeans before the invasions. If you enjoyed this recording, you can find more and support the production of these works at my website, johnlothe.wordpress.com. That's www.johnlothe.wordpress.com. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Lothe.